Ryan, what's on your radar?
West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin this weekend made another round of media appearances, warning his party that he's not ready to vote for the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package that's quickly moving through Congress. His rather bizarre argument is that there's not urgency to the situation.
We don't have an urgency. Don't you think we ought to debate a little bit more, talk about it, and see what we've got out there?
So you're not against this? You could support this $3.5 trillion plan?
No, I cannot support $3.5 trillion.
Okay, so that is all right, now we're getting to it is not a time issue. It really is a cost issue.
We got 5.4 out right now.
Okay.
That's a 3.5 they want to spend.
Over 8 or 10 years, depending on what.
3.5, but still, yeah, it's going to be it's going to be a lot more than 3.5 over 8 or 10 years because it'll continue. All those programs will never come off. They've only been scored out that far. Mm-hmm. But with that being said, that's a social reform. I'm just saying that we should be looking at everything, and we're not. And we don't have the need to rush into this and get it done within 1 week because there's some deadline we're meeting.
Okay, first of all, the deadline we're meeting is one that Josh Gottheimer and his crew in the House set. It's September 27th, and Gottheimer claimed he was allied with Joe Manchin in fighting for that deadline. So you can't insist on a deadline of September 27th and then ask why people are trying to hit that deadline. Manchin seems to think that Congress can simply pass the bipartisan infrastructure plan on September 27th and then just take their time with the other piece of it. But progressives the entire time have insisted that both have to move together, and that hasn't changed. Here's Bernie Sanders telling Joe Manchin that he knows how hard he worked on the bipartisan infrastructure plan, and it'd be a real shame if something bad happened to it.
And the last point that I would make on this, I know that Senator Manchin worked very hard. It's called the bipartisan infrastructure bill, $550 billion of new money to rebuild our roads and our bridges. What we have worked on is working both of those bills in tandem. They go together. And it would be a really sad state of affairs for the American people, for Congress, if both of those bills went down.
Do you think that's possible, that could happen right now?
Yeah.
Really sad. Would be really sad. But what's funny is that when that clip was shared on Twitter by a leading Republican operative, he posted it to make fun of Bernie Sanders, but he was surprised that people loved it. So he followed up with this, writing that, quote, "The bipartisan bill already passed the Senate. Bernie has no leverage to stop it now. In classic Bernie fashion, he talks a big game and accomplishes nothing." In response, I noted that Bernie also happens to have allies in the House, so it's not like he's powerless there. And Representative Mark Pocan responded by saying, "This is largely Bernie's values from the original negotiation. In the House, we are protecting and ensuring those values. He's been instrumental." So what makes this game of chicken between the progressive wing and the centrist wing different than normal is that Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and Joe Biden are on Bernie's side, not Manchin's side. That doesn't mean Manchin will definitely lose, but it means the deck is stacked heavily against him. Now, for people who weren't born yesterday, I understand why you might be confused at how it could be possible that Bernie Sanders and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden are genuinely on the same team fighting against Joe Manchin. But an overlooked moment Friday in the House Education and Labor Committee might help it make a little sense. And maybe Joe Manchin should pull up a chair for this one too, because he might learn why he and his friend Josh Gottheimer are almost completely isolated right now. Let's take a step back for a second. Over the past generation or two, House Democrats in swing seats, known internally as frontliners, have consistently voted to the right, hoping that a conservative voting record would appeal to voters in a divided district. Often, those Democrats represented rural, culturally conservative districts in which federal spending was coded as federal help for black and brown people, and that was something they didn't want to do. The shifting terrain of American politics has upended that calculation, as vulnerable Democrats are now more likely to represent suburban districts where federal spending is weighed on its own merits rather than pressed through the sieve of American race relations. Now, let's not ignore the irony here. The suburbs themselves are a creation of redlining, produced by subsidies geared toward white families in the wake of World War II, and ultimately cemented by white flight that was a response to desegregation and the civil rights movement. But the suburbs today are far more integrated than they were before, and many white suburban voters are conspicuously supportive of racial justice movements, opening up new potential for a realigned politics. At issue in the Education and Labor Committee was the design of the child care subsidy to be included in the party's reconciliation package. Centrists, drawing from the traditional Democratic playbook, suggested that the subsidy, which caps costs of childcare for a family at 7% of income, should be means tested and eligible only to those people who make 150% of their area's median income. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, meanwhile, wanted the subsidy to be universal. That's an age-old fight, and normally it would have ended there, with the CPC complaining that the bill didn't go far enough, but voting for a weakened version of it anyway. But this time, the Progressive Caucus itself was much larger and stronger, and more importantly, it had allies among the frontliners. Instead of opposing a universal benefit, swing district Democrats on the committee recognized that their own constituents would benefit from universality. Many parents in the suburbs would find their incomes above the means-tested threshold for benefits, yet they have tremendous difficulty affording childcare. That situation, middle-class voters feeling like their taxes are paying for benefits for others while they themselves struggle, is a recipe for economic resentment. It's what fuels the type of reactionary politics that powered Republicans in the suburbs for years. Over the past several months, CPC Chair Pramila Jayapal teamed with frontliners interested in expanding the subsidy, including frontline Democratic committee members like Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey, Jahana Hayes from Connecticut, and Susan Wild from Pennsylvania. Last week, Jayapal met with Pelosi to lay out the group's demands, and Pelosi offered to move the threshold to 200% as a concession. That wasn't enough, Jayapal said. The demand was to extend it to everybody. The committee, as it happens, is stacked with progressives. Representatives Ilhan Omar, Jamal Bowman, Raul Grijalva, and Mondaire Jones also serve on the panel. And Mondaire Jones had previously teamed with Senator Elizabeth Warren to write the expanded child care legislation. So the group took Jones's language from the bill that capped the family's cost at 7% and introduced it as an amendment. What made it powerful is that Mikey Sherrill agreed to be the lead sponsor, joined by Hayes and Jones. So instead of it being something off a progressive wish list, it came from a member up for re-election in a tough district, the type of race Democrats need to win to keep the majority. So now, in order to block the amendment, a Democrat wouldn't just have to say no to progressives. They'd have to be willing to risk blowing up legislation that frontline, vulnerable Democrats believe they need for re-election. They believed it so strongly that the group, including the frontliners, threatened to tank the entire bill if their demand wasn't met. And Committee Chairman Bobby Scott gave in. Scott said as much publicly. I believe that the underlying bill is more than generous in terms of benefits, and the reason that I'm giving credence to this amendment is because without it, the members of the committee are threatening to jeopardize the entire bill, he said. What Manchin might not realize yet is that if he and Josh Gottheimer want to take down this reconciliation package, they'll have to take on not just Bernie Sanders and AOC, but Chuck Schumer, Pelosi, Joe Biden, and basically every House Democrat up for re-election in a tough district. It's a which side are you on moment, and Manchin doesn't really have the option he used to have, the possibility of just switching parties and becoming a Republican, because he's way too liberal to make it through a Republican primary in West Virginia. Joe Manchin might not like it, but Bernie Sanders is the best friend he's got. Might as well warm up to it. So, Emily, do you think? How do you think I have the calculus here? Do you think this is real that swing district Democrats are actually now aligned against Joe Manchin?
I think this is completely real. And the reason on the other side of this, I actually think that this is dead on, is that it's a concession. And I don't mean it's a concession from you, but it's pretty clearly showing how the so-called moderate Democratic establishment on a lot of these issues, not all issues, especially not when you look at like Afghanistan, but on a lot of issues has moved so far left that they really are on, again, a lot of issues walking in lockstep with the progressive caucus. It's why the relationship between Justice Democrats and the Democratic establishment is nothing like the relationship was between the Tea Party, or I should say the Freedom Caucus, and the Republican establishment. The party is really moving left, and that's great news if you're a genuine leftist. It's not true on all of these issues. You're not going to get Nancy Pelosi to come and be a far left progressive on certain things, or Chuck Schumer, but it is amazing how the sort of center of the party is definitely the gravity is shifted leftward.
Yeah, Kim, what do you make of this weird shift going on?
Well, I mean, certainly as Americans are suffering, Americans need more support from the government. And so there is, of course, calls for that money, for the tax dollars to actually come back to the American people. But I'm curious, Ryan, what has happened to the rest of Gottheimer's gang? Where are they at? Do we know? Are they moving? Are they holding firm? What's going on with them? Do we know?
They're at the Palm.
Yeah. So the big question is how many would vote against the reconciliation package in the end. And right now you got Stephanie Murphy, who's kind of a late joiner of the Gottheimer gang, who's probably a pretty firm no. You've got Kurt Schrader in Oregon, who's probably a pretty firm no. But none of the others, including Gottheimer, are no's on this yet. Jared Golden is a maybe no. And Pelosi can lose. Currently, she could lose 3. Once Shontel Brown is sworn in, she could lose 4. Once Alcee Hastings' replacement is sworn in, she could lose 5. But so she still has the wiggle room. The big question will be, what happens on September 27th.
Well, but this dynamic is exactly why I always thought that huge, landmark legislation, even when Democrats hold that slim majority in the House and they hold the Senate, is virtually impossible on this issue. I actually still think that this is what blows up the entire thing, because that is sort of, as you say, Manchin doesn't have options here. He doesn't have a lot of options, and he's absolutely essential. That is an essential seat for Democrats. And so the establishment then is going to be thinking through the politics, and this is where you can say they're not as progressive as maybe they are on some of those things, because they're sitting back and thinking about the political calculus here, and that's where Nancy Pelosi's instincts kick in, and you see different decisions being made. But this is exactly sort of it's been happening in these flare-ups along the way. We see this every couple of weeks, something actually every week. But I expect this to be the dynamic that sort of ends these negotiations ultimately, or makes it the package much slimmer.
We'll see. And the argument they can make to him is look, in 2024, this is your best shot to say that you delivered all of this stuff. Because the trajectory you're on is going to have you losing. Yeah. Also, the piece I did on his daughter is going to make it tough for him, I think, in 2024 as well. Especially since people can look that up on EpiPen and his wife lobbying for EpiPen. And so it's going to be Joe Manchin week every week from here on out. But Kim, looking forward to what's on your radar next.